There may be some people on our channel because the UCC is not monolithic in its thinking that might question, why would I invite a senator on? We often hear people use the First Amendment to establish a line of demarcation between church and state. But in the words of Sandy Sorensen, who's the director of our advocacy office in DC, she often says the separation of church and state is a roadmap and not a roadblock. Mm-hmm. Faith voices are a critical part of the public conversation, and our personal politics describe how we as individuals choose to show up in this world. As a denomination, we claim a prophetic role, not beholden to any party or ideology. We will speak truth to whomever occupies the seat of power.
I also want to say, this is a time of tremendous crisis for our nation. Mm-hmm. And I'm deeply concerned. All across this country, the fight to dismantle systemic racism has reached a new threshold. And as we fight for social and racial and economic justice, we're in the middle of trying to battle a global pandemic. In times of crisis, it is so easy for people to retreat into fear and cynicism. But for those of us who believe in a higher power, we know that there is purpose and design in every moment of our lives. So we are not without hope. The deep injustices that we face are not inevitable. They were created and facilitated through racist, hateful, bigoted public policies. But here's the good news. That means they can be addressed by different policies that are brave and inclusive and moral. So you find me at this moment, Pastor Tracy, determined to answer the call for the fight for big structural change. My fight for social and racial and economic justice is anchored in my faith. I grew up attending the Methodist Church in Oklahoma. When I had babies, I took them to church. That's where I always tried to help in the little ways, the covered dishes and the costumes for the pageants. Eventually, I became a Sunday school teacher. That's a whole story in itself. And as a former Sunday school teacher, though, I know the impact that faith leaders have in the community. There is no doubt in my mind that spiritually inclined people of faith are called to fight for humanity. Some of the most monumental leaders of our time have understood this intersection. I believe as people of faith that we are not called on simply to have good thoughts, to have good hearts, but rather we are called on to act. We are called on to get up and feed the hungry, to get up and offer water to the thirsty, to get up and visit those in prison, to stand in the gap for the poor and the downtrodden, to remain grounded in the power of our faith, and to center the most vulnerable in the fight for justice. This current administration spouts hateful rhetoric toward religious minorities and communities of color. And it is our duty to combat this vitriol with love and affection. I believe that's what we're called to do.
There's a lot of religious language floating around in our nation's capital. And it's floating around from every direction and every aspect that one could imagine. And I'm wondering how much of that has to do with our interpretation, our theological interpretation of what it means to love a neighbor, and whether we should go back to defining what a neighbor is actually. Some, I think, define neighbor very narrowly to mean those who help them out and they help them out. And others of us try to understand the term neighbor in the sense of that great Sermon on the Mount that the rabbi preached to us, and also the parable of the Samaritan on the road in the Gospel of Luke, that the neighbor need not be the one close to you, but the neighbor is the one who needs your help. During a recent Democratic debate, when asked about the impact of state-sanctioned violence on Black people, you moved me because you did not only speak in general terms of the need for change, but I watched you call the names of those whose lives had been taken recently. Since that debate, several names have been added. Mm-hmm. Recently, I learned of the death of your brother, Donald Reed Herring, to COVID-19. May his memory be a blessing to all who knew him. Early on in the fight to stop the spread of COVID, you proposed a contact tracing plan. That was in April when you proposed that. And in April, according to the CDC, we were reporting 130,000 cases. Mm-hmm. And now, just a few months later, we have capped 2 million cases.
Mm-hmm. This is truly a crisis. And the injustices that we face in this were not inevitable. They were created and facilitated through racist, hateful, bigoted public policies. And like we were talking about earlier, that means that we can make change with different policies, with brave policies, with inclusive policies, with good plans, with moral public policies. I see this, Pastor Tracy's, we've got to make real change in our country. And it has to start, in my view, in the criminal justice system. We must fundamentally reform how law is enforced in America. We need accountability for law enforcement and accountability at every stage in our criminal justice system. And we need to rethink our overall approach to public safety. That means we need to transition away from a punitive system of locking people up and instead investing in community services that lift people up. But the thing is, we know that racism isn't just confined to the criminal justice system. We must also root out systemic racism in housing and education, healthcare, everywhere else. And the coronavirus pandemic is tied deeply into this. Communities of color are being infected and dying from the virus at alarming rates. I was so glad to have the chance to work with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley to pressure the federal government to collect and report demographic data so that we would actually know who was getting tested and what the results were. Mm-hmm. And what we've learned is that Black Americans are contracting the disease at nearly 3 times the rate of white Americans. In communities of color, I think of this as there's a crisis within a crisis, the crisis of racism and the crisis of what's happening with COVID-19. And we've got to be willing to fight back against this. One of the tools is we need to do more about the virus and attack this head on with more testing, more contact tracing. Part of it, though, is we need to go directly to protecting the workers. And that's why I've been supporting, why I've been fighting for an essential workers' bill of rights that protects the people who are out on the front lines, who are disproportionately people of color, disproportionately women. We need to be demanding more of our government so that our government is working not just on behalf of people who have plenty of resources, but so that our government is working for everyone. And we need to deal with the crisis in racism that has existed for so long, for generation after generation, but has been exposed during this coronavirus crisis. So we got a lot of work to do, but the first step in that is you got to call it out for what it is and then set your course to change it.
We are living in a time when our political leadership has an agenda against our LGBTQ siblings. We are watching attacks on gay rights, attacks on trans rights, and in many ways, the invisibility of particularly Black trans people who are losing their lives violently in this country and don't receive recognition from political leadership or media.
My faith tells me that every human being has value and that it is our responsibility to recognize that in others. You remember Matthew 25, right? The
Yes.
whole notion that the Lord is in each one of us. The glory, the power is within each one of us. And what that means to me is how important it is to hear every voice, to see every face, to lift up. To me, that's what this is all about. It's about how we reach out to others, and when we do, how much they give back to us. I believe that's what the Lord calls on us to do.
Something happened when uh, George Floyd lost his life, in my opinion, to state sanctioned murder. It hasn't gone to court yet. And the world watched as an officer of the state held his knee on his neck until his breath was gone. Something shifted. I haven't quite been able to figure out why George Floyd's death had the impact that so many deaths before him did not have, but we are here. And as communities around the world push to end institutionalized racism, I am reminded of the racial wealth gap that widens day by day. It is often held that some of the easier ways for families and individuals to amass wealth are through home ownership and business ownership. However, the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council released its 2019 Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data recently, covering the vast majority of mortgages made in the US in the past year. Like previous years, and this is no surprise to you, the data revealed that borrowers of color remain underserved in the conventional market. And as you know, Senator, just 2 days ago, under our current administration, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau removed the ability to pay rule from the small dollar lending organizations that tend to be predatory and the last resort option for many of those who are underserved by the conventional market. In addition, recent polls by Color of Change say that only 12% of Black and Latinx owned businesses received PPP assistance that they requested. And the consequences of this exclusion are staggering. Already, we are down 40% of Black owned businesses since this pandemic began.
I think the time has come for us to have an honest conversation about reparations, about the economic consequences, generation after generation after generation of the original stain of slavery. Second, we do have to focus in on what generations of government-sponsored racism and discrimination have done to the wealth of Black families and how it has widened the wealth gap. You know, we have to remember that the federal government played an active role in this, and it has to fix it. So, for example, the federal government sanctioned housing discrimination, and up through the mid 1960s said that taxpayer dollars would be used to lift up and encourage and help homeownership for white families, but not for families of color. Another part of this is we've got to cancel student loan debt. We know that Black students are more likely to have to borrow money to go to school, borrow more money while they're in school, and because of discrimination, have a harder time paying it back after they get out of school. We also should be investing more money in historically Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions. Those are just a few examples, but everything we're talking about here, the Black-white wealth gap, the Black-white health gap that we were talking about earlier, housing gap, education gap, all of those intersect. And they are the product of racism, the product of white supremacy, and the product of a government that has not addressed those aggressively and affirmatively. That's where we need to make change.
All too often in the US, our indigenous communities are forgotten or tokenized into mascots and caricatures. And we've seen as a result of systemic neglect in the COVID crisis is hitting Native communities especially hard. Time after time, the US government has failed First Peoples, has failed Native communities. Centuries of injustice toward Native peoples have led us to this moment. As the United Church of Christ, we are called to confess that violence and our participation in that violence as a church.
You know, the story of America's mistreatment of Native Americans is a long and painful one. And we are failing in our legal, political, and moral obligations toward tribal governments and toward indigenous peoples. To do better, we must ensure that America's sacred trust and treaty obligations are the law of this land, that they are binding legal and moral principles that aren't just a bunch of slogans, but instead that they are there to reinforce the solemn nation to nation relationships with tribal nations. This is an issue of respect. All of us in the federal government have an obligation to ensure that we're working to empower Indian country. We all have a legal and moral obligation to Native people. When COVID-19 arrives on tribal lands, we are obligated to fight to ensure that tribal nations and the Indian Health Service have access to the federal stockpile of PPE. It means fighting to ensure that tribal nations get the aid they need to prevent their economies from collapsing. And it means calling out the administration when it drags its feet on sending that aid. We need to commit to being strong partners to tribal nations on important issues that face Native communities. You know, for example, we should be doing everything we can to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that means we need to be reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act without any more delay. That is just one example. There is so much more to be done, but we owe it to Native communities to get in this fight and stay in this fight. It is our moral obligation.